This customer spent tens of thousands of pounds on this battery storage system and it isn't working properly. The customer's frustrated because after spending tens of thousands of pounds to get a battery storage install to complement his solar, it just isn't working. And he's brought us in to investigate. So Alan, I understand your solar system is not quite working as you expected.
It's not.
What's been happening?
My solar panels, which are on the garage here, total is about 6.3 kilowatt capability of loading. So but I've got no storage. I had no storage.
Yeah.
So I arranged for this, which is 20 kilowatt hours. After it was installed, I realised that I was only getting about half my capacity.
Okay.
So when I went back to the installer, he said, "Oh, but that's because the input to your garage area here is only 30 amps. So I've never been able to fill my batteries full."
Wow.
Which sounds like a waste of money.
Yeah. First things first, we'll look at what it's doing now because this is quite interesting. So I can see on here, the batteries are charging at the moment.
Yes.
But only at about 1 kilowatt. It'd be interesting to see on your MyEnergy app, we can look at the stats a little bit and see what that's been doing. Have you got that to hand at all?
It's in the house on my phone.
Okay, do you want to go and grab it?
Yes, I will.
We can have a look at it. Yeah, perfect. So first things first, should we do a neat or not neat on this? I've seen a lot worse, to be fair. Could be neater, but seen a lot worse. Now, the supply in here looks like it's 6 mil, which would be this main armoured feeding in here, and then presumably this one is the one that's going to feed the Zappi. 6 mil feed on a 32, maybe a 40 amp breaker is about the most that you can get. So there might be some kind of load limiting in place on the MyEnergy system to actually stop it from pulling too much power and blowing the supply to the garage. That's something that we can look at in the settings. If we click on the Libbi, then we can see that it's currently at 41% state of charge. The green bit is charge.
Yep, that's what came in from Octopus overnight.
Okay, so you've set it up with Octopus Intelligent Go, is it?
Yes.
Right, okay. So it's automatically set to charge up on the cheap rate electricity overnight, which is great. A lot of customers do that as a way to reduce their average cost per kilowatt hour. Then it's slowly discharging throughout the day until about lunchtime, when it seems like the solar has started to spike. Was it a bit cloudy earlier?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So about lunchtime, about 11 or 12, the solar started to spike and the batteries started to charge up again. But it seems like it's only charging at a fairly low rate, like you say. It's charging at 2.1 kilowatt at the moment. Yeah, it's a 5 kilowatt inverter, so it can charge and discharge at 5 kilowatts, which it's not doing. It might be that they've set some kind of limit on the system, like you say, to avoid it blowing the supply to the garage. So yesterday, very similar, around 3 kilowatt charge, then it starts to discharge. Does the Arga kick in the morning?
It does, yes.
So that's the Arga kicking in, and it'll warm up and then it'll stay hot for the rest of the day, I guess. We'll look at how much you're pulling from the grid, because we can see that on the main screen here. This is the grid. So if we click on the grid history, it's not showing anything at all.
There was something he said about because there was something separated, he couldn't get the grid on its own.
That's strange. Sure. And the Eddy, is that working as expected, or?
The Eddy is the hot water, and it only comes on if there is excess power, and if it's never reached excess.
Right, okay. Well, that gives me a good overview. What I'll do is I'll dig into the settings a little bit on here just to get my head around that. I'll look at all the connections and the cabling here as well, just to check that that's okay. And then we'll look at the solar inverter. Is that in the loft?
It's in the loft, yes.
Right. Is there a ladder that we can get up there?
No problem.
So the customer's got a 5 kilowatt solar edge inverter here. What that means is that there's optimizers under every panel. Because there's so many different roof facets facing in different directions, it's the only solution really for a system like this is either microinverters or optimizers. And Solar Edge is a good system, we use it quite a lot. Having the inverter up in a loft like this is not ideal for multiple reasons. The customer's just said himself that he's not allowed to come up here anymore, understandably, because, you know, at a certain age you don't want to be crawling up and down loft ladders and battling your way through spiders' webs. But how are you supposed to access this as a customer to check if it's safe, if it's working properly? You can't. So then you've got to call somebody out every time that you're worried about it and, you know, pay them to come out and do that. We don't fit inverters in lofts, full stop. We don't fit batteries in lofts either, because there's guidelines that say that you shouldn't. And this perfectly illustrates the reason. You know, it's covered in cobwebs, you can't access it easily for maintenance. And the Eddy's up here as well, which is a similar thing. You know, it needs maintenance and checking. It's got settings on it that you can check with the buttons. So really it's better to have it within reach somewhere where it could be easily accessed for maintenance. But we're going to check over all of this and see if it's set up properly. So what I like about the MyEnergy stuff is you can see on the screen what it's doing. So we're currently generating 1 kilowatt of solar, house is using 1.9, so we're pulling power in from the grid. Now I can't see the Libbi battery on here at all, so I don't know whether this has been synced up with the Libbi battery or not. We're going to look into all the settings and see if it's configured properly, but I've got a feeling that they might have run in CTs for these. It's literally only showing the Eddy. It should show the Libbi and the Zappi, so for some reason it's not been paired up with the other devices. There are no CTs connected to this, which I would expect there to be. It might be that the CTs are connected to the Zappi, but either way there should be a grid CT, there should be a solar CT, and there should be a local load CT for the garage board to stop the garage board from being overloaded. So we need to check if those 3 CTs are in place. If not, then we're going to have to try and fit some or arrange that to be done for the customer. So while we're here, we're just going to do a firmware update on all of the devices as well to make sure that they're up to the latest firmware. That can avoid any bugs that might have crept in over time, and it's really easy for us to do that while we're here. So that's downloaded. Now if I click install, it's now going to install the latest firmware. And that's done, easy as that. So we've now just logged into the SolarEdge inverter and we're doing a firmware update, and then we can just check to make sure that it's all working as it should be. So if you're not familiar with a MyEnergy Eddy device, what it does, it's a solar hot water energy diverter basically. It detects the amount of solar that's being generated. If you start exporting power to the grid, it'll switch on the power to your immersion heater. So in this case we've got a tank here. We've got the flex from the immersion heater going from the Eddy. So you've got power into the Eddy, and it's basically like a smart device that reads how much solar is being exported, and it will just ramp up and heat the hot water with that excess energy. So if you've got half a kilowatt or 1 kilowatt of excess energy, it will ramp up and just start heating your hot water with that excess energy. And it's a great way to basically turn your hot water tank into a kind of a heat battery. You know, you've got a huge tank of water there, you can heat it up for free with solar energy rather than exporting it to the grid and getting next to nothing for it. So while we're up here, what we're going to do is check the MC4 connections for the solar, make sure that they've all been done properly, and the routing of the cables. Now I can see already that these cables are a little bit loose. They've just been clipped with plastic clips, which can easily become brittle over time. But we're going to trace the cables, check the roof penetrations to make sure that nothing untoward is happening there. So for example, here, look, I can see it's an interesting roof because it's a wooden clad roof, and then under there you can see the DC cables go through, and it looks like there's a bit of DC cable coiled up there where the SolarEdge optimizer is located. Now the customer says all the panels are generating okay, so we've got no reason to particularly worry about this, but it's always good to just check it while we're up here in the loft. We've got another run down here, goes all the way along down into this section. Now, as a little side point, when we're doing electrical inspections and particularly EICRs, we always check the thermal cutout on the immersion heater. They should have what's called a double stat, which is where they've got the thermostat that's built into them, which you set at say 60 degrees or whatever, and then they should have a backup one that if the main one fails, the backup one kicks in. That's because if the main one fails, what can happen is the water can just boil and boil and boil, and what happens is the water boils up because heat rises, then it goes into the plastic tank in the loft. Now what happens to plastic when it gets super hot? It melts. So imagine boiling water going into this plastic tank, then the plastic tank bursts and boiling water pours through the loft. And this did actually happen once with, sadly, a baby that was sleeping in a cot. The hot water tank burst, boiling water poured through the ceiling and the baby died. So very sad, tragic incident that basically taught a lesson that you need to have a double stat in your tank if you've got a plastic water tank, cold water tank in your loft. I don't think this one is, so this is something that we'll note on our report that could do with upgrading really. So in the SolarEdge system, what we're looking at is Are all the optimizers reporting? Yes, they are. We're checking the grid code to make sure that the grid code is set to the UK grid code 230/400, and then site communication is the communication with the Modbus meter to be able to see whether it's exporting or importing, etc. So it looks like there is a Modbus in place. We can check that. That's probably going to be by the consumer unit. You join me once again in a small cupboard. I seem to have the habit of finding myself in these kind of places, but the reason is all of the mains electrics to the house are here. So you've got our main incomer, which is quite a nice old vintage one. Then from there we go into our smart meter. From the smart meter it goes into this Henley block, which is a little bit loose and wonky. Not too happy with that. Then from there, it goes into the switch fuse. Now, this is the switch fuse that feeds the garage. And when I took the consumer unit off in the garage, I thought it was a 6mm supply, but it's actually a 10mm. So it's a 3-core 10mm steel wire armoured cable. That means it can take around 50 amps. And the fuse in this switch fuse here is actually rated at 50 amps. So we have a decent supply to the garage. It doesn't seem to me like there's a real need to limit the Libbi. Certainly not down to 18 amps anyway, when we've got 50 amps of capacity here. And there is a way with some smart devices to put a local limit on that garage board using a Harvey to avoid that the Zappi and the Libbi both charge up at the same time. That's all that's needed really in order to protect that board. The other thing to note here is that you've got a solar edge CT here. This CT stands for current transformer or current transducer. It's basically a clamp that goes around the cable with a magnetic, like a ferromagnetic coil, and it measures current that's passing through it both ways. This allows the solar edge system to read how much power is being exported or imported into the property. Now, there's a problem with this, and it's quite simple, but they've put it in the wrong place. So they've only put it around the main tail from the main house consumer unit, whereas it should go around this main tail that does the whole property. And that's why the solar edge system has been reading import and export wrong, because this CT was installed in the wrong place when it was first installed, which is crazy because it's been in for quite a few years now. It's a simple fix. We'll unclip that, we'll put it around the right place, and then the solar edge system will start to read properly at least. But that's not really solving the problem that the customer's got with the MyEnergy system, so we still need to dig a bit deeper. The customer's just explained something to me which makes a lot of sense. The garage supply was installed in 2008, way before the solar was installed. So this alteration was not done by whoever did the garage install, it was actually done by whoever installed the MyEnergy system. It seems like what they did is they put this switch fuse in order to upgrade the supply to the garage to be able to cope with the Zappi and the Libbi, and they've therefore done these tails, which is why they're more modern than 2008, but they've not moved the solar edge CT, and that, to be honest, is not a good sign, because they should have known. You know, if they're installing Libbis and Zappis, they should know what a solar edge system does and how a CT works. You know, maybe they've never come across solar edge before, but if you're doing renewables, you should be aware of all of the various systems that you're trying to integrate with. So a little bit of a negative point for the MyEnergy installer there. Now, another thing that I've just picked up on here is the solar PV circuit is fed into a shared RCD. Now, these RCDs are not bi-directional, and PV should either be on an MCB or it should be on its own dedicated double pole RCBO. But to be fair, that's a fairly new update to the regulation. So when this was installed, it might have been perfectly compliant. It looks like it's on a 20 amp circuit breaker here in the consumer unit, and they've just shifted everything across when they've added the PV circuit, and they've not relabeled everything, which is just a little bit lazy. They've just literally put arrows across to show that they've moved all of the circuits across. You know, those little touches make a big difference, and an installer that doesn't properly label their stuff, kind of, it's questionable how much care that they're taking with everything else if they can't even take care with a few stickers. Right, so we've opened up the consumer unit. This is the MyEnergy CT for the solar, which looks to have been installed correctly. However, it's a little bit weird. They've run the solar edge Modbus circuit off the same breaker, and it's a 20 amp breaker, but it's only a 1mm or 1.5mm flex that's feeding that. I would always put the solar edge Modbus on its own separate dedicated circuit, because It's just, yeah, it's just a bit of a weird way to do it, to bunch it up with the solar circuit. They do have a spare breaker here as well, so they could have just swapped that out for a 6-amp breaker and put the Solar Edge mod bus on its own circuit, or at least put it off one of the lighting circuits on its own breaker there. So that's something that I'm going to note down as well for the report. The plot thickens. So what we've found here is that the Zappi isn't connected to anything. It can't see the solar, it can't see the grid, it's not talking to any of the other devices, and the date and time are wrong in it as well. So we're going to have to reconfigure the Zappi. But first let me show you this in the garage. So I thought we'd do a bit of a load test on this garage and see how much power it could potentially pull, because it seems like the original installer basically decided to limit the charge and discharge rate of the Libbi because they thought that it would need to protect the main cable feeding the garage. I guess in theory they're thinking, well, you might be charging the car at 7 kilowatt and charging the battery at 5 kilowatts, so that's 12 kilowatt, and then potentially you could have stuff going on in here as well which could push you over to a lot higher wattage. But realistically, all we've got is lights and sockets in the garage here, right? There's a little feed for a little room out the back there as well, but again, that's just lights and sockets. And the obvious scenario that most people use to charge their car and their batteries, worst case scenario, is they're charging them both overnight on the cheap electricity in wintertime to, you know, substitute for the lack of solar generation at that time of year. So imagine this building's pulling 12 kilowatt at that time. There's very unlikely to be anything else going on apart from maybe this fridge freezer. So, you know, a few watts, a few hundred watts more. Maybe they could be pulling 13 kilowatt maximum here. That's about 55 amps. That's not a lot. And that's worst case scenario. Now this 10mm cable can survive with 55 amps. There's a 50 amp fuse at that end, but that fuse is not going to blow until it hits 100 amps, 150 amps, something like that. So it's not at risk of blowing the fuse. So what I'm going to do is remove the limit on this Libbi, because I think that from a safety point of view, it's fine to charge and discharge at full rate. From a usability point of view, it's annoying that it's currently limited, because it means the customer's pulling from the grid when he could be pulling from his batteries. Once we get everything up to date, then we're going to pair it all together. We're going to set it all up properly, because I really think that it's purely just a lack of proper configuration on this system. And without any major alterations, we can get it all working in a lot better way. This clamp meter's just told me something really interesting. It's saying that 74% of our viewers who watch our videos regularly haven't subscribed to the channel yet. What's that all about? So, if you do one thing after watching this video, it'd really help if you hit subscribe. Helps the channel to grow, and it also means you don't miss out on future content. So now that we've updated the firmware on this, the first thing we're going to do is remove the charge limit. So we're going to put that right up to as high as it can go. 18 amps it's saying. Discharge limit 22 amps. Perfect. So the charge limit was set correctly, because the charge rate is slightly lower on these than the discharge rate. But the discharge rate is what was holding back the system. It was set to 18 amps instead of 22. So we've set that. Now we're going to look at the network. There is an import limit of 80 amps. Now I think that's probably because there is an 80 amp main fuse. We can see if we can identify the main fuse, but I'm not 100% sure because it's a very old service head. If not, we'll leave that as it is and assume that that's been done correctly. And then we're going to export. So they've put an export limit of 1 amp on here. Do you want to be able to export power from the battery? No. Okay, so that's fine. In CT config, there's no CT set up on this one. Linked devices, we can see the Zappi, we can see the Harvey, the Eddy is coming up with a question mark, and that might just be because it's so far away. So it seems like this is the master device. So that's good, that's how it should be. So everything on here looks good. What I don't understand is why the Zappi is not showing up the solar generation, so we need to look into that. So that's the first thing. Because it's got no Wi-Fi connection, it might not be speaking to the internet, which is why the date and time are out of date, but it might also affect it speaking to the other devices, although I don't think it should. It should have its own internal wireless signal that speaks between the devices. That's different to Wi-Fi as far as I'm aware. And failed. It should try again. I think what happens is it tries a few times because the signal's not great, and then eventually it gets a connection. We'll leave it keep trying for a few moments. So it's now saying we're connected to the internet. And if we go to Wi-Fi information page, we do now have an IP address and stuff, which is great. So that's a step in the right direction. Now we need to update the firmware on this one. So we're going to go to download firmware, check for updates, and it's found some updates, which it's now downloading. CT configuration is probably one of the #1 things that I see with solar installs that have not been done properly. It's one of those things that it's so simple but so complicated in a way, because it can be confusing as to which way around the CT needs to go, whether it's facing the flow of power from the solar or facing the flow of power from the grid. And you've got multiple CTs, and when you've got multiple tails from different consumer units, it's something that confuses a lot of installers, especially when they're new to renewables. With this one, it was just completely on the wrong tail altogether. But now I've refitted that. I've removed it from the trunking as well, because you don't really want interference between AC cables and these little signal cables, and it was just running in the trunking with the AC cables. So I've just brought it outside the trunking to avoid any interference, and I've reclipped it around this main tail now. So hopefully we'll start to see better readings from the solar edge system. So what I'm going to recommend is that we install another CT on this cable here that just goes to the garage. That will measure how much power is going to the garage, and then if it reaches 50 amps at any point, it will just ramp down the Zappi and the Libbi just for protection. So it means you can have them full rated, but it's just there as a belt and braces in case you ever decided to turn everything on in the garage and risked overloading the cable, which is very unlikely. So, you know, I'm happy to set it up as is now without the CT, but I think as an extra protection, just in case, it would be good to add that in. So the firmware's been downloaded. Now I need to actually install it. So I'm going to press install. Then it's going to go through that process of basically taking the files that it's downloaded from the cloud and integrating it into the device. That's the classic Zappi sound that we've used to. Yes, we've got solar visible now. Whoa, look at that. Fantastic. So we can see our solar now, so the devices are all communicating with each other, which is exactly what we wanted. So that's a win. Now the date is correct. Brilliant. So that's everything properly configured and working, and to be honest, the biggest job was just updating all the firmware. Now, our customer Alan asked a really good question, which is, do I need to go around and do that myself manually regularly? Unfortunately, the answer is no. On these systems, when they've got a good internet connection, they will do automatic updates if you allow that within the app. So we'll set that up for Alan before we leave. That means you as a customer don't need to go around and check and update the firmware all the time. But it does mean you need to make sure that there's a good internet connection to all of these devices. And that was the issue here. They hadn't been paired properly to the internet. They hadn't all been linked together properly. The firmware was on different versions between all the devices, and they just weren't all talking to each other properly. That and a few little configuration issues. And that was all it was, really. So probably installer lacking a bit of education. I think that this system was installed when the Libbis were first released. It was a new product. So not necessarily a cowboy installer, maybe just somebody who wasn't quite sure what they were doing when they started installing this system. And we all live and learn, right? But ultimately, the main thing is we've got this system up and running for the customer, which is fantastic. And it's going to be a lot more effective now at storing that solar energy and then using it to run the house overnight. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you watch these two videos up here, which YouTube thinks you'll like too.